Welcome to the football clubs that made us. Long-form stories from the history, heartbreak, and glory of the world's football clubs. My name is Paul Blake, and in each episode we'll take a closer look at one football club. Its history, its rivalries, its great successes, and unfortunately, its failures too. Sometimes it'll be your favorite club. Sometimes it might be the club you love to hate. Either way, we'll go beyond the scorelines and the trophy lists to explore the stories, characters, quirks, and moments that helped make the club what it is. We'll start each episode with a few questions, just to see where you stand. Then, at the end of the podcast, we'll come back and give you the answers. So, welcome to the football clubs that made us. Before we get started on today's club, Tottenham Hotspur, here are 5 questions to test your knowledge of the club and give a little heads up on what we will be covering today. Question 1. What was Tottenham Hotspur originally formed from? Question 2. Why is Tottenham's 1901 FA Cup win so historically unusual? Question 3. What was the name of Arthur Rowe's famous Spurs playing style? Question 4. In the original 1981 FA Cup final against Manchester City, which City player had the unusual distinction of scoring for City and also scoring the own goal that brought Spurs level? Question 5. In the 2018-19 Champions League semi-final against Ajax, which Spurs striker came on at halftime in the second leg and helped change the momentum of the tie? So, how well do you know Spurs? The answers will be given at the end of today's recording. Episode 1. Tottenham Hotspur. Glory, near misses, and the eternal hope machine. Tottenham Hotspur are one of those football clubs that seem to carry several identities at once. They are historic, glamorous, ambitious, stylish, occasionally chaotic, often frustrating, and somehow always capable of convincing their supporters that the next chapter might be the one where everything finally clicks. From the outside, Spurs are easy enough to describe. They are a famous club from North London playing in white, represented by a cockerel standing proudly on a football, housed today in one of the most impressive stadiums in world football, and followed by supporters across the globe. They have a long list of great players, famous nights, cup wins, European adventures, and unforgettable goals. They also have something else that is harder to measure but impossible to ignore, a relationship with hope that is almost heroic in its persistence. That is part of what makes Tottenham such an interesting club to explore. Their history is not simply a march from one trophy to another, nor is it the story of a club without success. Spurs have won league titles, FA Cups, League Cups, and European trophies. They were the first British club to win a major European competition, and at their best they have represented a very particular footballing ideal, that the game should not only be won, but played with imagination, movement, and style. And yet, in the modern imagination, Tottenham are often spoken about through the language of almost, nearly champions, nearly European champions, nearly ready, nearly there. That reputation can be unfair, but like many unfair things in football, it contains just enough truth to be annoying. Spurs have lived through eras when they seemed close to something transformative, only for the moment to slip away, sometimes dramatically, sometimes painfully, and sometimes in ways that made rival supporters far happier than was strictly necessary. But to reduce Tottenham to jokes about not winning enough is to miss the richness of the story. This is not a club built on empty mythology or modern branding. It is a club with deep roots, a strong sense of place, a distinctive football identity, and a history full of characters, contradictions, and beautifully strange details. It is also a club whose beginnings were far more modest than the modern stadium, global fan base, and Premier League profile might suggest. To understand Tottenham Hotspur properly, we need to go back to North London in the early 1880s, long before the Premier League, before Champions League music, before transfer deadline day, before tactical analysts, before social media arguments about whether a fullback has inverted correctly. Football itself was still taking shape. Clubs were emerging from schools, churches, workplaces, cricket teams, and local groups of friends. The sport had rules and organization, but it was still local, physical, experimental, and wonderfully homemade. Tottenham's story begins in that world. The club was founded in 1882 as Hotspur Football Club by a group of schoolboys connected with Hotspur Cricket Club. One of the central figures was Bobby Buckle, who would become the club's first captain and one of its most important early organizers. Before Tottenham were Tottenham, before the cockerel, before the double, before European trophies, before Harry Kane and Son Heung-min, before supporters had to develop a complex emotional toolkit for surviving match days, there was a group of boys looking for something to do when the cricket season ended. That is a beautifully simple origin story. One of English football's great clubs did not begin with a commercial plan or a carefully written statement about elite performance. It began with young people wanting to play a game through the winter. In modern football terms, where almost everything arrives wrapped in strategy, branding, and media content, there's something refreshing about that. The first great Tottenham decision was not about revenue growth or global expansion. It was essentially, cricket is finished. Shall we play football? The original name, Hotspur, gave the club a sense of drama from the start. It is associated with Sir Henry Percy, better known as Harry Hotspur, the medieval nobleman later made famous by Shakespeare. The name carries ideas of speed, boldness, fire, and rebellion, which is not a bad emotional summary of Tottenham at many points in their history. Spurs were never going to sound like a quiet, sensible club. Even before they became Tottenham Hotspur, the name suggested something with movement and energy. The Tottenham part came later as the club developed and needed a clearer identity, but the Hotspur name remained at the heart of it. That combination is important. Tottenham rooted the club in place. Hotspur gave it personality. Together they created one of English football's most distinctive names, local enough to belong to a community, dramatic enough to carry a mythology. And then there is the gas lamp. The founding story often includes the image of lads meeting under a gas lamp on Tottenham High Road to discuss the formation of the club. As with many football origin stories, it sits somewhere between history, memory, and legend, but it is almost too perfect not to use. Football clubs need these images. Some are born in factories, some in churches, some in schools, some in pubs, and Spurs have this wonderfully cinematic picture of young founders gathered under a lamp in North London with no idea that the thing they were starting would still be making people nervous more than 140 years later. The gas lamp image works because it captures the scale of the beginning. There was nothing inevitable about Tottenham becoming a major football club. They did not begin as a global institution. They began as a local team formed by boys, supported by adults who helped organize and stabilize the club, and gradually shaped by the community around them. Like many early clubs, they had to find opponents, pitches, funds, structure, and a reason to keep going. Clubs in that period were fragile. They could disappear as quickly as they appeared. Tottenham survived, and then they grew. The early years were, unsurprisingly, not glamorous. Tottenham played local matches, developed their structure, built their reputation, and gradually found their way into the wider football world. But then, in 1901, came the first truly extraordinary moment in the club's history. Tottenham Hotspur won the FA Cup. That achievement matters on its own, but the detail that makes it remarkable is that Spurs were not a football league club at the time. They were outside the league, which makes the 1901 FA Cup win one of the great early shocks in English football history. In modern terms, it is difficult to find a fair comparison. We celebrate giant killings now when a lower league club beats a Premier League team in the third round, especially if the cameras can find a substitute goalkeeper who also works as a delivery driver. Tottenham did not just enjoy a nice cup run, they won the entire competition. This gave Spurs something very powerful: early national credibility. They were not simply a local North London side anymore. They had done something that placed them firmly into football history. Before the league titles, before Bill Nicholson, before the double, before the European trophies, Tottenham had already announced themselves through the FA Cup. It also began to shape one of the great themes of the club's identity. Tottenham and cup football have always had a particular relationship. The league is the long examination, the test of consistency, squad depth, and weekly reliability. The cup is more dramatic. It is a stage for moments, heroes, sudden turns, and emotional chaos. In other words, it suits Spurs rather well. After that early FA Cup triumph, Tottenham's development became more structured. They entered the Football League in 1908, which was a significant step in the club's growth. This was no longer just a local or regional force with one spectacular national achievement. Spurs were becoming part of the formal football establishment, and with that came a different kind of challenge. It is one thing to win a cup as an outsider. It is another to prove, week after week, that you belong among the country's leading clubs. The years that followed brought promotion, relegation, rebuilding, and further moments of success. Tottenham won the FA Cup again in 1921, which reinforced their connection with the competition and gave the club another major honor in the years after the First World War. But like many clubs, Spurs' progress was not a straight line. Football history is often tidied up after the event, made to look smoother than it was. In reality, clubs move through uneven periods: good seasons, difficult seasons, financial pressures, managerial changes, players arriving, players leaving, crowds growing, crowds grumbling. Tottenham were no different. What is important, though, is that the club kept building a sense of itself. Spurs were not merely collecting results. They were developing an identity, and by the middle of the 20th century, that identity would become much clearer. The man who helped give it shape was Arthur Rowe. Arthur Rowe is one of those figures who deserves to be better known outside Tottenham circles. He was born in Tottenham, played for Spurs, and later returned as manager. There is a satisfying neatness to that, a local boy who understood the club not as an abstract institution, but as something rooted in place, memory, and feeling. He had played for the club in the 1930s, and when he became manager after the Second World War, he brought with him an idea of football that would become central to Tottenham's story. That idea was push and run. At its simplest, push and run meant pass and move. You give the ball, you move into space, you receive it again. It sounds almost obvious now because modern football is built on movement, triangles, rotations, and passing angles. But at the time, Rowe's approach gave Tottenham a freshness and rhythm that set them apart. It was quick, intelligent, collective football. It asked players not simply to clear the ball or carry it too long, but to trust each other, move for each other, and create space through speed of thought. There is something beautifully democratic about that kind of football. It is not just about one star dribbling past everyone, although Spurs have had plenty of players capable of that over the years. Push and run depends on relationships. It depends on the player with the ball and the player without it understanding each other. It depends on timing, awareness, and movement. In a way, it is football as conversation. One pass asks a question, the next run provides the answer. Under Rowe, Tottenham did not just play attractive football. They won. In 1949-50, Spurs won the second division, returning to the top flight. Then, remarkably, In 1950-51, they won the first division title. To win promotion and then immediately become champions of England is extraordinary. It was not simply a good run, it was a transformation. That 1950-51 title was Tottenham's first top-flight league championship, and it changed the club's sense of what was possible. The FA Cup win of 1901 had shown that Spurs could make history in a single competition. Rose League title showed they could be the best team in the country across a season. That is a different kind of achievement. It requires depth, consistency, and resilience. It requires a team to answer questions every week, not only when the cup draw has produced a special occasion. It also gave Tottenham a footballing inheritance. Push and run did not just win matches, it created a template. It suggested that Spurs at their best should be clever, quick, fluid, and brave. The team should move the ball. The players should move themselves. The crowd should be given football that had rhythm and imagination. That inheritance would become even more powerful under Bill Nicholson. Nicholson is the towering figure in Tottenham's history. If Arthur Rowe gave Spurs a footballing language, Nicholson turned it into poetry with a hard edge. He had been part of the club as a player, including the push and run era, and when he became manager, he brought together style, discipline, ambition, and ruthlessness in a way that produced the greatest team Tottenham have ever had. His first match in charge was against Everton in October 1958, and Tottenham won 10-4. That is not a managerial debut so much as an announcement made with fireworks, symbols, and several confused defenders. Most managers would be happy to begin with a narrow 1-0 win and a polite handshake. Nicholson began by producing a scoreline that looks as if someone accidentally left the goals open. Of course, one wild result does not make a dynasty, but it gave a hint of what Nicholson wanted Tottenham to be: bold, attacking, ambitious, and difficult to ignore. Over the next few years, he built a side that combined skill, intelligence, toughness, and goals. It was not simply pretty football, it had edge, it had leaders, it had players who could pass, think, tackle, run, create, and finish. The great team of 1960-61 is still the reference point. That season, Tottenham won the league and FA Cup double. To modern ears, familiar with treble talk, quadruple talk, and clubs with squads deep enough to field 2 international teams, the double may need a little context. In English football, winning the league and FA Cup in the same season was a monumental achievement. It demanded consistency across the long grind of the league and nerve in the sudden death theater of the cup. Spurs did both. More than that, they did it in style. They began the league season with 11 straight wins, setting a pace that immediately made the rest of the country pay attention. That kind of start does 2 things. It builds momentum, but it also creates pressure. Every week, the question grows louder. Can they keep this going? With Tottenham, that question has often carried a slightly nervous laugh, but Nicholson's side had the quality and mentality to sustain their challenge. The team had balance in almost every area. Danny Blanchflower was the captain, the thinker, the organizer, the man with the authority to shape the game and the language to explain it afterwards. Alongside him, Dave Mackay brought steel. If Blanchflower represented the brain of the team, Mackay was the heart, lungs, and when necessary, the clenched fist. John White, known as the Ghost, brought intelligence and subtlety. Cliff Jones brought speed and directness. Bobby Smith gave power and goals. It was a collective with multiple ways to hurt opponents. Then came Jimmy Greaves. Greaves arrived after the double season, so he was not part of the league and cup triumph of 1960-61, but he became central to the Nicholson era and to Tottenham's broader mythology. To discuss Spurs without Jimmy Greaves would be like discussing British comedy without mentioning timing. He was one of the greatest goal scorers football has ever produced, and he scored with a kind of casual certainty that made finishing look less like a skill and more like a personal habit. His arrival strengthened an already great period, and under Nicholson, Spurs continued to collect major honors. After the double in 1961, they won the FA Cup again in 1962. Then, in 1963, they moved from domestic greatness to European history. The European Cup Winners' Cup final against Atletico Madrid in Rotterdam is one of the great nights in Tottenham's history. Spurs won 5-1, and in doing so became the first British club to win a major European trophy. That is a huge statement. Before Liverpool's European dynasty, before Nottingham Forest's extraordinary European Cups, before Manchester United's later triumphs, before the Champions League became the center of the football universe, Tottenham had already gone into Europe and made history. The scoreline itself carries a kind of swagger. Tottenham Hotspur 5, Atletico Madrid 1. Not a narrow win, not a defensive survival mission, not a late scramble followed by several players collapsing in relief. A 5-1 victory in a European final. It feels very Nicholson. It feels very Spurs at their best. If you are going to make history, make it handsome. The Nicholson years gave Tottenham a golden age, but they also gave the club something complicated, a standard that later generations would have to live with. Once a club has had a team like that, supporters never fully forget it. Even those who were not alive to see it inherit the memory. They hear the names, see the old footage, read the stories, absorb the mythology, and somewhere in the background a question forms, why not again? That is the gift and burden of history. The years after 1963 still brought success, but no golden age lasts forever. Great teams age, players move on, opponents adapt, and football changes. After Nicholson's departure in the 1970s, Tottenham began to wobble, and by 1977 the club wrote one of the strangest-looking sentences in its history. Tottenham Hotspur have been relegated. For younger supporters, especially those who have grown up with Spurs as a permanent Premier League club, it almost feels like a piece of alternative history. Although for anyone who lived through the nervous events of the 2025-26 season, perhaps it does not feel quite as strange as it once might have done, but more of that particular emotional adventure later. In 1977, though, relegation was a shock. The club that had won the double in 1961 lifted a European trophy in 1963 and built one of English football's great identities, dropped out of the top flight. Relegation is humiliation, disruption, and uncertainty all arriving together. It affects finances, players, recruitment, pride, and the mood around the club. It also gives rival fans material they can keep in storage for decades, which is one of the crueler realities of football life. But in Tottenham's case, the relegation story has an important second half. Spurs came straight back up. The club did not disappear into a long wilderness. Keith Birkinshaw remained as manager, and the team returned to the First Division after one season away. That immediate recovery mattered because it prevented relegation from becoming the defining feature of the era. Instead, it became a shock, a warning, and eventually the starting point for a revival. Birkinshaw is an important figure in Tottenham history because he sits at the center of that revival. He was not the glamorous name in the way some of his players would become glamorous names, but his Tottenham side of the late 1970s and early 1980s restored color and success to the club. Under him, Spurs won trophies again, played memorable football again, and gave supporters a team with personality. One of the key figures in that period was Glenn Hoddle. Hoddle is one of those footballers who seems to belong naturally to Tottenham, not just because he came through at the club or because he played there for so long, but because of the kind of player he was. If Spurs have always had a weakness for style, imagination, and technical beauty, then Hoddle was almost too perfect for them. He played with elegance, vision, and calm, as if the game were happening at a slightly slower speed in his head than it was for everyone else. Then, in 1978, Tottenham did something that felt genuinely bold. They signed Ozzy Ardiles and Ricky Villa. This was not just a normal transfer story. Ardiles and Villa had just been part of Argentina's World Cup winning squad. Foreign stars were not common in English football at the time, certainly not in the way they are now, when a Premier League dressing room can sound like a meeting of the United Nations with shin pads. In 1978, bringing two Argentine World Cup winners to North London was a major statement. It brought glamour, it brought curiosity, it brought culture shock, it brought excitement. It also brought a wonderful sense that Tottenham, having just come back from relegation, had decided the sensible recovery plan was to add a little South American magic. There is something very Spurs about that. Other clubs might have come up from the second division and decided to focus purely on consolidation, stay organized, keep things tight, avoid risks, maybe sign a dependable center half with knees made of concrete. Tottenham signed World Cup winners from Argentina. It was ambitious, unusual, and slightly theatrical, which means it fits perfectly into the club's story. The FA Cup final against Manchester City in 1981 needed a replay after the first match finished 1-1. The replay became one of the classic Wembley occasions. City were dangerous, Spurs were under pressure at times, and the match moved with the kind of unpredictability that makes cup finals feel like theater rather than sport. Then Ricky Villa produced the moment etched in the memory of all who have seen it. Villa picked up the ball, drifted forward, and began to move through the City defense. It was not just a run, it was a little piece of football choreography. He seemed to glide, pause, shift, and slide past challenges in a way that made defenders look less like professional athletes and more like people trying to catch a falling hat in the wind. Then he finished, and the goal instantly became part of Tottenham folklore. Some goals are important because they win matches. Some are remembered because they are beautiful. Villa's goal was both. It won the FA Cup for Spurs, but it also looked like the kind of goal Tottenham supporters want to believe belongs to them. Stylish, dramatic, individual, brave, and just a little bit absurd. They retained the FA Cup in 1982, beating Queen's Park Rangers after another replay. Again, Tottenham and the FA Cup seemed naturally drawn to each other. The competition had been part of the club's identity since 1901, and here they were, 8 decades later, still finding glory through Wembley drama. But the Birkinshaw era was not only about domestic cups. In 1984, Tottenham won the UEFA Cup, beating Anderlecht in a 2-legged final that eventually went to penalties at White Hart Lane. The details are pure football drama, tension, home crowd, penalties, and a young goalkeeper, Tony Parks, becoming an unlikely hero. Penalty shootouts are cruel things. They reduce a team sport to individual walks from the halfway line, which seems like something invented by a committee with a deep interest in human stress. For supporters, they are almost unwatchable. For players, they are a test of nerve that can define a career. For goalkeepers, they offer one of the few moments in football where they can become instantly legendary. Tony Parks took that moment. His saves helped Tottenham win the shootout and with it the UEFA Cup. For Spurs, it was another European trophy and another reminder that the club's history was not confined to England. The European thread that began so powerfully in 1963 continued in 1972 and again in 1984. By the second half of the 1980s, Tottenham were again trying to work out what the next version of the club should be. The Birkinshaw years had restored success and color, but football was changing quickly. English football itself was moving towards a new era, though it did not yet fully know what shape that era would take. Stadiums, Television, commercial income, club ownership, and the image of the game were all about to shift dramatically. Spurs, as so often, were somewhere between glamour and instability. Into this world came Terry Venables, one of football's great characters. Clever, charming, tactically sharp, media-friendly, and comfortable in the space where football met personality. His Tottenham side would become closely associated with two of the biggest English football names of the period, Gary Lineker and Paul Gascoigne. Lineker was already an established star. He had scored goals for England, Barcelona, and Everton, and he brought to Spurs the calm, precise menace of a striker who seemed to know exactly where the goal was without needing to make a big fuss about it. Gascoigne was different. Paul Gascoigne was not just a footballer, he was a national event. Gaza had extraordinary ability, but he also had a personality that made him impossible to ignore. He played with instinct, imagination, and mischief. He could dribble, pass, shoot, tease opponents, and lift a stadium simply by receiving the ball. He also carried a vulnerability that became increasingly visible as his career and life unfolded. Even in the joyful parts of the story, there is a sadness around Gascoigne because everyone knows what talent was there, and everyone knows how complicated the human being behind it was. At Tottenham, though, Gaza gave supporters something unforgettable. He was the kind of player who made people lean forward. With some players, you watch because they are effective. With Gaza, you watched because anything might happen. It might be brilliant, ridiculous, reckless, hilarious, or all four within the same 5 minutes. The 1990-91 FA Cup run built towards one of the most famous North London derby moments of all time. The semi-final against Arsenal at Wembley. A North London derby is never just a football match. It is geography, pride, family arguments, workplace tension, old grudges, and future bragging rights compressed into 90 minutes. Even a dull North London derby is not really dull because the emotional context does half the work. But an FA Cup semi-final at Wembley between Arsenal and Tottenham carries an extra level of pressure. There is the final at stake, of course, but there is also the terrifying possibility of watching your biggest rival walk past you on the way there. For Spurs, the 1991 semi-final became one of the great days. The defining moment came early from Paul Gascoigne. Tottenham won a free kick from long range, and Gaza stood over it. It was not the kind of position where a sensible player would necessarily be expected to shoot. But Gaza was not always in close conversation with sensible. He hit it with ferocious confidence, and the ball flew past David Seaman. It remains one of the most replayed goals in Tottenham history. Spurs beat Arsenal and reached the final. That would be glorious enough on its own, but the final added another layer of drama because Tottenham rarely take the straightforward route through history. The 1991 FA Cup final was against Nottingham Forest, managed by Brian Clough. That alone gives the match a certain weight. Spurs had star power and cup momentum, but they also carried pressure. The club had financial issues in the background. Gaza was expected to deliver, and the FA Cup mattered enormously. Then the match began, and Gascoigne seemed almost overwhelmed by his own intensity. He made an early wild challenge and escaped punishment. Then he made another, this time on Gary Charles near the edge of the Spurs area, and injured himself in the process. Stuart Pearce scored from the resulting free kick, Nottingham Forest went ahead, and Gascoigne was stretchered off with a serious knee injury. It is one of the strangest and saddest sequences in FA Cup final history. Gaza, the emotional center of Spurs' cup run, had effectively removed himself from the final through his own recklessness. The player who had lit up the semi-final was gone before the final had properly settled. In narrative terms, it was almost too cruel. In football terms, it was a reminder that genius and chaos often travel together and not always helpfully. At halftime, Spurs were losing 1-0 and had lost Gaza. It would have been easy for the day to collapse completely, but Spurs responded. Paul Stewart equalized in the second half. The match went into extra time, and the decisive moment came when Des Walker diverted the ball into his own net under pressure. Tottenham led 2-1, and this time they held on. Spurs had won the FA Cup for the 8th time. It was a triumph, but like so many Tottenham triumphs, it came with complicated emotions attached. They had beaten Arsenal in the semi-final, won the cup, and added another major honor to the club's history. But the image of Gascoigne leaving the field injured sat heavily over the final. The day was both celebration and sadness. Tottenham had glory, but not without cost. And then, almost immediately, football changed. The Premier League began in 1992, and English football entered a new commercial age. Television money reshaped the landscape. Clubs became bigger businesses. The gap between those who adapted quickly and those who did not began to widen. The glamour of players, managers, and clubs increased, but so did the financial pressure. For Spurs, the Premier League era did not begin as a smooth march towards modern dominance. The club had history, support, and moments of quality, but they were not positioned like some of the clubs that would come to dominate the new era. Manchester United became the great early Premier League power. Arsenal, painfully for Spurs supporters, would soon become a major force under Arsene Wenger. Chelsea would later be transformed by Roman Abramovich's money. Tottenham, meanwhile, often seemed to be trying to carry old glamour into a new world without quite having the structure to match. There were still moments of joy. Jurgen Klinsmann arrived in 1994 and immediately understood how to turn criticism into theater. Accused of being a diver before he had even properly settled into English football, he scored on his debut and celebrated by diving across the pitch. It was funny, self-aware, and instantly memorable. David Ginola brought a different kind of glamour. He looked like a film star who had accidentally wandered into a football match and found he was better than everyone expected. His balance, hair, stride, and confidence made him feel almost absurdly suited to Tottenham. Ginola was not always the most practical footballer in a hard-nosed tactical sense, but Spurs supporters have never judged players only by practicality. He gave them beauty, and beauty has always had a strong currency at Tottenham. There were also trophies, most notably the 1999 League Cup under George Graham. That one came with a small complication because Graham was so strongly associated with Arsenal that his appointment at Tottenham felt, to some supporters like discovering a fox, had been hired to manage the henhouse. But football has a way of making strange arrangements feel normal if a trophy appears at the end, and the League Cup gave Spurs their first major honor since 1991. The arrival of ENIC and Daniel Levy in the early 2000s marked the beginning of a new long-term phase. Levy would become one of the most discussed, criticized, defended, and analyzed figures in modern Tottenham history. To some, he represented financial discipline, business intelligence, and the transformation of Spurs into a modern global club. To others, he came to symbolize caution, managerial churn, and a failure to turn promising teams into enough trophies. The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the messy middle, which is inconvenient for anyone who likes simple football arguments. On the pitch, the early Levy years were uneven, but Martin Jol gave Spurs a more recognizable sense of progress. His Tottenham were not perfect, but they felt like a step forward. Players like Dimitar Berbatov, Robbie Keane, Jermaine Defoe, Ledley King, Michael Carrick, and Aaron Lennon gave Spurs a mix of intelligence, pace, goals, and technical quality. For the first time in a while, Tottenham began to look like a club with a plausible route back towards the top end of the table. Ledley King deserves special mention here. In a club often associated with attacking beauty, King was a defender of rare elegance. At his best, he seemed to tackle without needing to make a scene. There was a calmness about him, a sense that he could solve danger without turning it into drama. His career was limited by injuries, which is one of the great Tottenham frustrations of the era. Because fully fit and fully available, he might have been recognized even more widely as one of England's outstanding defenders. Even with this array of stars under Juande Ramos as manager, Spurs sat at the bottom of the table. Then came Harry Redknapp. Redknapp's arrival changed the mood almost immediately. He brought experience, simplicity, confidence, and a wonderfully direct way of speaking about football, where some managers can make the game sound like a doctoral thesis in spatial occupation. Redknapp often made it sound like something that could be improved by good players playing in positions they understood. There is more to him tactically than the caricature suggests, but his great skill was creating belief and getting talented players to express themselves. Under Redknapp, Spurs recovered quickly, then began to climb. The squad had quality: Luka Modric, Gareth Bale, Rafael van der Vaart, Jermaine Defoe, Peter Crouch, Aaron Lennon, Michael Dawson, Ledley King when available, and others who gave the team balance and personality. Tottenham were becoming exciting again, and this time the excitement was attached to league progress. The breakthrough came in May 2010, away at Manchester City. That match carried huge significance because both clubs were chasing Champions League qualification, and City were beginning their own transformation into a financial and footballing force. For Spurs, finishing fourth would mean entry into the Champions League qualifiers and a return to Europe's elite competition. In the context of modern football, it was more than a good league finish. It was a doorway. Peter Crouch scored the decisive goal late in the match, heading in to give Tottenham a 1-0 win. It was one of those moments that did not look especially elegant in the way Spurs mythology sometimes demands, but it was absolutely beautiful in meaning. A tall striker, a header, a scramble of emotion, and suddenly Tottenham were heading towards the Champions League. The Champions League campaign that followed in 2010-11 gave Tottenham some of their most exciting modern nights. It also gave Gareth Bale his global breakout. The night that changed everything came against Inter Milan at San Siro in October 2010. Spurs were in trouble. They were down to 10 men, trailing heavily, and the match looked like it might become a lesson in European embarrassment. Then Bale began running and running and running. His second-half hat-trick didn't win the match. Inter still won 4-3, but in some ways the score became secondary. Bale had announced himself on the European stage with a performance of such speed and power that everyone watching understood something had shifted. He tore down the left side again and again, turning elite defenders into men who looked as if they had accidentally joined a race they had not trained for. In fact, it could be said Brazil legendary fullback Macon might just have never recovered. Taxi for Macon his epitaph. Bale would develop into a superstar before moving to Real Madrid. His departure was painful, but also symbolic. Tottenham had developed a player into one of the most valuable footballers in the world. That said something about the club's progress, but selling him also raised the familiar question: could Spurs keep their very best players long enough to build something truly lasting? That question would return again with Luka Modric and later with Harry Kane. What Spurs needed next was not just another star or another exciting season, but a manager who could build a culture. Someone who could take the energy, the infrastructure, the academy talent, the growing ambition and the hunger of the fan base and turn it into a team with identity, intensity, and belief. That manager arrived in 2014. Mauricio Pochettino did not come with the global glamour of some names linked to major Premier League jobs, but he brought something Tottenham badly needed: clarity. His teams pressed, ran, worked, developed, and believed. He was not just trying to assemble good players, he was trying to create a collective. One of the great symbols of that era was Harry Kane. Kane's emergence changed Tottenham. He had been around the club for years, sent on loans, doubted by some, and not immediately treated as an obvious future superstar. Then suddenly, or at least it felt sudden from the outside, he became the center-forward Spurs had been waiting for. There is something deeply satisfying for supporters when a great player comes through their own club. A brilliant signing is exciting, but an academy player becoming the main man hits differently. It feels personal. Alongside Kane came Dele Alli, one of the most exciting young players in English football. At his best, Dele played with mischief, timing, and edge. Christian Eriksen gave the team craft. Moussa Dembele gave Spurs power and control in midfield, often moving through pressure as if opponents were minor inconveniences. Son Heung-min brought speed, directness, two-footed finishing, and a visible joy that made him easy to love. Kane and Son would eventually form one of the most productive attacking partnerships in Premier League history, but under Pochettino, the whole team had a collective force. This was a proper team, with physicality, pace, technical quality, and belief. What made the Pochettino era so powerful for supporters was that Spurs no longer felt like outsiders trying to sneak into the elite conversation. They felt like they belonged in it. They were not just hoping for a good cup run or a dramatic one-off win. They were competing week after week near the top of the Premier League, and they were doing it with a young side that seemed to have room to grow. The 2015-16 season was the first great title push. Leicester City's fairy tale season became one of the most astonishing stories in modern football, and Tottenham were the team that chased them hardest for much of the run-in. In another year, Spurs' progress might have been the story, but Leicester's story was so extraordinary that everyone else became part of their backdrop. For Spurs fans, it was exhilarating and painful. The famous 2-2 draw at Chelsea, the so-called Battle of the Bridge, has become one of the defining emotional snapshots of that season. Tottenham lost their composure, Chelsea took enormous pleasure in stopping them, and Leicester were confirmed as champions. For neutral football fans, it was theater. For Spurs supporters, it was a stress test with shin pads. The following season, 2016-17, Tottenham were arguably even better. They finished second behind Chelsea, played superb football, and turned White Hart Lane into a fortress in its final season. There was something deeply poetic about that. The old ground, full of history and memory, was given one last great team. Spurs were unbeaten at home in the league, and the farewell to White Hart Lane felt like the closing of a chapter that had lasted generations. White Hart Lane mattered in a way that is difficult to explain if you only think of stadiums as buildings. It was not the biggest or most modern ground, but it was Tottenham's emotional home. It carried the ghosts of Nicholson, Greaves, Hoddle, Ardiaz, Villa, Gascoigne, Klinsmann, King, and so many others. It had seen trophies, collapses, European nights, local derbies, terrible refereeing decisions, brilliant goals, and all the ordinary rituals that make a football ground part of people's lives. To leave it was necessary, but it was also painful. The new stadium would give Spurs a platform for the future, but White Hart Lane held the past. In 2016-17, Pochettino's side gave the old place the farewell it deserved, and yet again there was no trophy. That is the uncomfortable truth at the heart of the Pochettino era. It was a success in almost every developmental sense. Spurs became stronger, younger, fitter, more tactically coherent, more respected, and more consistently competitive. They produced and improved players, reached finals, challenged for titles, and became a Champions League club. but they did not win silverware. This is where the debate becomes emotional. Some people look at that period and say, no trophies, no success. Others argue that judging it only by trophies misses the scale of what was built. Both views contain truth. Football is about winning, and players and managers are ultimately measured by honors. But football clubs also go through periods where identity, progress, and belief matter. Pochettino gave Tottenham all three. Then came the Champions League run of 2018-19. In some ways, it was an odd season. There was an oddness to the season. Spurs were dealing with injuries, squad fatigue, no signings in the previous summer window, and the emotional and logistical complications of waiting to move into the new stadium. It was not a smooth campaign, but European football has a way of producing stories that do not obey the logic of league form. The quarterfinal against Manchester City was wild enough to deserve its own documentary. Tottenham won the first leg 1-0 at their new stadium, then went to Manchester for a second leg that became one of the most dramatic Champions League matches ever played. Goals flew in, momentum swung wildly, and in the final moments, City thought they had scored the goal to knock Spurs out, only for VAR to intervene. Spurs survived on away goals. Next on the journey, Ajax of Amsterdam. Ajax were the romantic team of that Champions League season, young, fearless, technically gifted, and already responsible for knocking out Real Madrid and Juventus. Spurs lost the first leg 1-0 at home, then went to Amsterdam and found themselves 2-0 down on the night, 3-0 down on aggregate at halftime. At that point, the tie looked finished, not difficult, finished. And then Lucas Moura happened. Lucas scored once, then again. Suddenly the impossible became visible. Ajax became nervous, Spurs became urgent, and the match shifted from football into something closer to collective disbelief. Deep into stoppage time, with the tie almost gone, Lucas completed his hat trick. Tottenham had come back from 3-0 down on aggregate to reach the Champions League final on away goals. It is one of the greatest moments in the club's history, not because it won a trophy, but because of the emotional force of it. Football is at its most powerful when it makes the impossible feel briefly negotiable, and that night in Amsterdam did exactly that. Players collapsed, Pochettino cried, supporters lost themselves, and Tottenham Hotspur were going to a Champions League final. The final itself was painful. Liverpool scored early through a Mohamed Salah penalty, and the match never quite became the wild, emotional contest Spurs needed. Divock Origi scored late, Liverpool won 2-0, and Tottenham's great European run ended one step short again. That defeat hangs over the Pochettino era because it was both an astonishing achievement and a brutal ending. Reaching the Champions League final was historic. Losing it left a wound. For supporters, there was pride, but also the terrible knowledge that chances like that do not come around often. The team had climbed all the way to the edge of glory and found Liverpool waiting there with a locked door. A few months later, Pochettino was gone. His departure in November 2019 felt like the end of a relationship, not just the sacking of a manager. The results had declined, the energy had faded, and perhaps the team had reached the end of its cycle. But emotionally, it was still difficult. Pochettino had given Tottenham supporters some of their most hopeful modern years. He had made the club feel young, brave, and connected. He had brought them close enough to dream. After Pochettino, Tottenham entered one of the strangest periods in their modern history. The club did not just need another coach. It needed to decide what kind of club it wanted to be next. The answer, initially, was Jose Mourinho. Mourinho's arrival was fascinating because it seemed almost like Tottenham trying on someone else's coat. Mourinho was one of the most successful managers in football history, but his identity was very different from the romantic Spurs ideal. He was associated with winning, control, pragmatism, conflict, tactical detail, and a kind of emotional siege warfare. Tottenham, historically, had liked the idea of style and expression. Mourinho liked trophies. In theory, this was the point. Spurs had been beautiful under Pochettino but had not won silverware. Mourinho had spent a career winning silverware, sometimes while making beauty wait outside in the car. The calculation was clear. Perhaps Tottenham needed less romance and more ruthlessness. It didn't work. There were good moments, and Kane and Son were devastating in transition, but Mourinho's Spurs never fully felt like a long-term fit. When he was dismissed shortly before the 2021 League Cup final, it felt like another very Tottenham twist. Appoint the serial winner to win a trophy, then remove him just before a final. Nuno Espirito Santo followed briefly in a spell that never really caught fire. Then came Antonio Conte, a manager of huge intensity and pedigree. Conte brought structure, authority, and a clear tactical shape. His best period was impressive, especially the run that secured Champions League qualification in 2022. But Conte is not a manager who hides dissatisfaction, and by the end the relationship felt strained almost beyond repair. By then, Tottenham supporters were tired of resets. Mourinho had not solved it. Nuno had not settled it. Conte had not completed it. Spurs had tried proven winners, tactical disciplinarians, and high-profile names, but the club still seemed to be searching for a coherent identity after Pochettino. Enter Ange Postecoglou. Ange arrived in 2023 with a very different energy. He spoke clearly, warmly, and directly. He wanted attacking football. He wanted bravery. He did not seem interested in lowering expectations or apologizing for ambition. For a fan base bruised by years of managerial turbulence, that mattered. Suddenly, Spurs had someone who sounded like he understood not only the need to win, but the need to enjoy watching the team again. His start was superb. Tottenham played front-foot football, pressed high, took risks, and made supporters feel connected to the team. The departure of Harry Kane to Bayern Munich in 2023 could have flattened the club emotionally, but Ange's early months instead created momentum. Son became captain, new players settled, and Spurs briefly looked like the Premier League's great early season surprise. The 2023-24 season eventually settled into a fifth-place finish, which was still a strong first campaign and returned Spurs to Europe. But the second season became much more complicated. The 2024-25 campaign was one of the most contradictory in Tottenham history. Domestically, it was extremely poor. Spurs finished 17th in the Premier League, a position that looked almost surreal for a club of their size. And yet, in the same season, Tottenham won the Europa League. That is the kind of contradiction only football can produce. A league season of deep frustration and anxiety, combined with a European trophy that ended a 17-year wait for major silverware. Spurs beat Manchester United 1-0 in the final, delivering the trophy supporters had craved for years. Ange became the manager who finally ended the drought. Normally, that would secure a manager's place in club affection for years. In one sense, it did. No one can remove the trophy. No one can say he failed to deliver silverware. But football does not always allow one success to cancel out wider concerns, and Tottenham's league form was impossible to ignore. Ange departed in June 2025, shortly after the European triumph, leaving behind a legacy that is both simple and complicated. He won, but the team also struggled badly. That is a very Spurs paragraph. Win a European trophy, finish 17th. Part company with the manager, start again. Thomas Frank arrived in June 2025, bringing with him a strong reputation from Brentford, where he had built one of the Premier League's most admired smaller club projects. Frank seemed sensible, intelligent, and modern, a coach who could bring structure without entirely abandoning ambition. But Tottenham is not Brentford. The scale is different, the pressure is different, and the tolerance for slow development is very different. Frank's time at Spurs was short. By February 2026, he was gone, with results and performances again forcing another change. For supporters, it was another exhausting turn of the wheel. The club had gone from Pochettino's long emotional project to Mourinho, Nuno, Conte, Ange, Frank, and another reset. That kind of churn does not just affect tactics, it affects belief. Every new manager asks supporters to buy into a story. After enough false starts, even optimistic fans begin checking the receipt. Yet even in the turbulence, the club remains compelling. That is one of the strange things about Spurs. They are rarely dull. Even when they are frustrating, they are interesting. There is always a storyline, a manager under pressure, a young player emerging, a tactical idea being debated, a rival enjoying themselves too much, a European night, a transfer argument, a sense that the club is either on the edge of something brilliant or about to step on a rake. Which brings us neatly to those rivalries that are just as much a part of a club's identity. No history of Tottenham Hotspur would be complete without them, because football clubs are not only shaped by what they win, they are shaped by who they cannot bear to lose to. For Spurs, the obvious starting point is Arsenal. The North London derby is not simply a fixture. It is a civic disturbance with football boots. It is geography, history, resentment, pride, family arguments, school playground debates, workplace tension, and a great deal of extremely selective memory. Every supporter remembers the wins in perfect detail and treats the defeats as administrative errors that should probably be deleted from the record. The rivalry has roots in Arsenal's move from Woolwich to Highbury in 1913. From a Tottenham point of view, this was not just another club changing address. It was an invasion. Arsenal had moved into North London, and Spurs supporters did not greet this development with a warm neighborhood hamper and a note saying, "Lovely to have you nearby." The sense of territory mattered, and it still matters. There was also the controversy around Arsenal's election to the First Division in 1919 when league football resumed after the First World War. Tottenham were relegated as the league was expanded, while Arsenal were promoted despite finishing only fifth in the second division before the war. You do not need to be a conspiracy theorist to understand why Spurs supporters were unimpressed by this. In football terms, it was exactly the kind of historical grievance that can be passed down through generations like an heirloom clock, except louder and with more swearing. Chelsea occupy a different place in the Spurs' imagination. This rivalry is not as geographically neat as Arsenal, but it has developed real heat. Part of it comes from London competition, part from big matches, part from Chelsea's rise as a major force in the modern era, and part from the sheer number of painful moments they have inflicted on Tottenham. The 2015-16 Battle of the Bridge is central here. Spurs were chasing Leicester City in the title race and needed to win at Stamford Bridge to keep their hopes alive. They led 2-0, but Chelsea fought back to draw 2-2, confirming Leicester as champions. The match became infamous for its intensity, bookings, confrontations, and emotional loss of control. For Tottenham, it was agony. For Chelsea, who were not going to win the league themselves, there seemed to be an almost artistic satisfaction in making sure Spurs did not either. West Ham are another interesting case. From the Spurs side, this rivalry is often treated with a slight shrug, as if to say, yes, they care more about this than we do. West Ham supporters may disagree quite vigorously, and that disagreement is part of the rivalry's charm. Matches between the clubs have frequently carried an edge, and West Ham have enjoyed more than a few afternoons where damaging Tottenham's ambitions felt like a trophy in miniature. For Spurs, these rivalries all do slightly different things. Arsenal is the defining local rivalry, the one that sits deepest. Chelsea is a modern London rivalry sharpened by pain, money, and big game trauma. West Ham is the awkward neighborly tension that Spurs sometimes pretend not to care about until they lose, at which point everyone cares very much indeed. Rivalries also help explain Tottenham's emotional landscape. A club's history is not only built in finals and title races, it is built in derbies, in the matches supporters circle first, in the fixtures that can rescue or ruin a week. Tottenham's identity has been shaped by the joy of beating Arsenal, the pain of Chelsea stopping them, the irritation of West Ham celebrating against them, and the endless North London argument over who has the bigger history, better future, better stadium, better players, and better reason to feel hard done by. So where does the Tottenham story go next? That is always the question with Spurs, because the club's history refuses to sit still. Tottenham are not a club that can comfortably live as a museum. The past is too vivid, but the future is too tempting. The double, the European trophies, the cup finals, the great players, the old White Hart Lane nights, the Pochettino years, the new stadium, the 2025 Europa League win, all of it creates a powerful sense that Spurs should matter, and they do matter. The question is whether they can matter in the way their supporters want. Modern Tottenham have almost everything a major football club needs. They have a huge fan base, a magnificent stadium, strong commercial potential, elite facilities, a global profile, and a history that gives the club emotional weight. They are not trying to invent themselves from nothing. They are trying to align what they already are. That is the challenge. For years, Tottenham's infrastructure has looked ahead of the team. The stadium says elite. The training ground says elite. The revenue base says elite. The history says elite. But the football has too often said rebuild. At some point, the club has to close that gap. The dream is not complicated. Spurs supporters want a team that can compete consistently at the top of the Premier League, win trophies regularly enough that every final does not feel like a referendum on the meaning of existence, and play football that feels connected to the club's identity. They want ambition, but not chaos, style, but not softness, patience, but not drift, spending, but not panic. A plan, but not one that takes so long everyone forgets the opening paragraph. The 2025 Europa League win can help if the club uses it properly. It reminds everyone that Tottenham can still win in Europe. It connects the present to the club's European past. It gives younger supporters a trophy of their own, not just stories inherited from parents, grandparents, or YouTube clips. But one trophy cannot carry an entire future. It has to become evidence of what is possible, not an excuse to stand still. There is also a psychological challenge. Tottenham need to change the emotional story from nearly to next. Nearly is heavy, nearly carries regret, nearly looks backwards. Next looks forward. The club's best future will come if it can honor the past without being trapped by it and use the pain of near misses as fuel rather than identity. Because the danger for Spurs is that the almost story becomes too comfortable. It gives everyone a role. Supporters suffer nobly. Rivals laugh predictably. Pundits recycle familiar lines. The club promises another rebuild. The cycle begins again. Breaking that cycle requires more than a good season. It requires football clarity over several years. But that is also what makes Tottenham fascinating. The ingredients are there. The club is not small. The stage is not modest. The fan base is not passive. The history is not empty. Spurs are one of the few clubs where a genuine breakthrough would feel enormous, not only because of what it wins, but because of what it resolves. Imagine Tottenham winning the Premier League. That sentence alone carries weight. It would not be just another title. It would be a release of decades of longing, jokes, frustration, and hope. It would connect the modern club back to 1951 and 1961. It would change the way rivals talk. It would change the way supporters talk about themselves. It would take the word Spursy and, at least for a while, lock it in a cupboard. And perhaps that is why Spurs are such a perfect club for this series. Their story has everything. Those local boys under a gas lamp and a name borrowed from a medieval knight. A non-league FA Cup miracle through to push and run. Bill Nicholson, the double, European firsts, Greaves, Blanchflower, Mackay, and White, relegation and revival, Hoddle's elegance, RD Yes and Villa bringing Argentina to North London, Gaza's free kick and heartbreak, Klinsmann's dive, Bale destroying Inter, Kane and Son, Pochettino's almost team, a Champions League final, a new stadium, a European trophy, a league season that made everyone check the table twice, and always, always, the feeling that the next chapter might be the one. That is Tottenham Hotspur, a club of glory and gaps, beauty and anxiety, history and unfinished business. A club that has won enough to know what greatness feels like, but not recently enough in the league to stop craving it. A club that can make its supporters laugh, rage, dream, despair, and come back again next weekend with suspiciously renewed optimism. In the end, maybe that is the most honest way to describe Spurs. Tottenham are not simply a football club that disappoints or delights. They are a football club that keeps the emotional volume high. They make history feel close enough to touch and success feel close enough to hurt. They have built a modern stage worthy of the biggest nights, and now the question is whether the team can fill it. The future dream is simple. Make the stadium feel like White Hart Lane with a rocket engine, build a team that matches the badge, turn European glory into sustained momentum, give the supporters not just memories, but a new era. And finally, after all the almost, maybes, and what-ifs, give Tottenham Hotspur the one thing their history keeps asking for, a next great team, not a nearly team, not an almost team, a great one. Before we finish, here are the 5 questions from today's episode. Question 1, what was Tottenham Hotspur originally formed from? The answer, a group of schoolboys connected with Hotspur Cricket Club, who wanted a winter sport when cricket season ended. Question 2. Why is Tottenham's 1901 FA Cup win so historically unusual? Answer, because Spurs won the FA Cup while they were not a football league club. Question 3. What was the name of Arthur Rowe's famous Tottenham playing style? Our answer, push and run. Question 4. In the original 1981 FA Cup final against Manchester City, which City player had the unusual distinction of scoring for City and also scoring the own goal that brought Spurs level? Answer for question 4, Tommy Hutchison. 3. What was the name of Arthur Rowe's famous Tottenham playing style? Our answer, push and run. Question 4. In the original 1981 FA Cup final against Manchester City, which City player had the unusual distinction of scoring for City and also scoring the own goal that brought Spurs level? Answer for question 4, Tommy Hutchison. Question 5. In the 2018-19 Champions League semi-final against Ajax, which Spurs striker came on at halftime in the second leg and helped change the momentum of the tie? And the final answer, Fernando Llorente. So, how did you do? If you got all 5 right, congratulations. You may now safely use the phrase push and run in public. If you got fewer than 3, don't worry. Like Spurs, you are not wrong. You are just in a long-term development project. And that brings us to the end of this episode of the Football Clubs That Made Us. Long-form stories from the history, heartbreak, and glory of the world's football clubs. Let us know how many of the quiz questions you got right, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. Are you a lifelong supporter, a neutral observer, or maybe someone who just enjoys watching this club cause emotional damage to others. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, follow, or leave a review. It really helps the podcast grow and helps other football fans find us, and let us know which football club you'd like us to cover next. It might be your club, your rival's club, or the club you secretly admire but would never admit to in public. Until next time, thanks for listening to the football clubs that made us.